in 1789, just on the eve of the French Revolution, a clergyman and intellectual by the name of Abbé Sieyès published a pamphlet entitled What is the Third Estate? And this pamphlet laid out the historic understanding of the way society was held together as three separate estates, with the clergy on top as the first estate, and with the nobility and all of the rulers of France as the second estate. And then, on the bottom, comprising 95 or more even of the nation, was the third estate, the commoners, the middle class. And in many ways, Abbé Sieyès encapsulates all of the ideas that sparked the French Revolution itself. He argued in the pamphlet that the third estate, because it was so large, did not really need the first or the second estates. It did not need the nobility, the classic hierarchy of kings and noblemen. And, of course, it did not need the clergy, certainly not as lords, much less as spiritual sovereigns over their hearts and souls. And the legacy of Sieyès' pamphlet is that he encapsulates the overturning of the old order. Society would no longer be set up as it was from the Middle Ages all the way down until the early modern period. And he alleges that the Middle Ages were oppressive, that the system that had been in place for so long, for nearly 800 years, was tyrannical, that it abused the lay people, that it treated commoners like slaves, and that the demise of this system would only improve France for the future. In this lecture, we're going to go back into the Middle Ages and look at the three estates. How did they come about? What was their intention? And what role did they serve in shaping the medieval church all the way down until the modern world? And as we've already seen, from about 900 until 1000 AD, Europe went through a stage of fragmentation. The Roman Empire had collapsed in the mid-5th century, and the reigns of Charlemagne and his successors had attempted to restore some level of the order and the prestige of the Roman Empire within their realms. And that, of course, led them to call their kingdom the Holy Roman Empire, even despite the fact that it had not a bit of Romanness within it at all. Still, it speaks to the way in which Europe still viewed itself in the late antiquity period. They didn't see themselves as all that different from their Roman predecessors, with the one great exception of the fact that they were overtly Christian and that they ruled from the north. Still, the Holy Roman Empire had ruled all of these regions in northern Europe for some time. During the time of the Tetrarchy in the 4th century, the Augustus in the west, first Constantius Chlorus and then his son Constantine after he was declared to be the Augustus against the natural hereditary order that had been established. All these regions were in northern Europe. They were in Trier. And so the Carolingian Empire and all of its successors had some claim to the fact that they were simply continuing on with the way things had been before, though with some general differences. However, with the rise of Islam and with the coming of the Vikings, and with the natural way that the kingdoms all began to break down, eventually one could not maintain the old order of one kingdom ruling over vast areas of Europe without any breakdown or lesser nobles or others ruling regionally. And so by 1000 AD, what begins to happen is Europe goes through a number of changes. It goes through changes culturally and it goes through changes intellectually that give rise to the three estates concept. Culturally or socioeconomically, the changes were pretty dramatic. One of the first things that happens in this period of the Middle Ages is you have a number of climactic changes to the weather that really begin to shape the way the agrarian patterns of Europe developed. This period of time is sometimes called the Little Optimum. It's also called the Medieval Warm Period, or the MWP, by specialists. And this period lasts from 950 to 1250, and exact numbers escape us as to how much the temperature fluctuated. But we do know that during these centuries, the average temperature goes up pretty significantly, only a few degrees overall on the average. But those few degrees are pretty significant. Those few degrees mean that you have greater rainfall in the north, which means crop yields are much higher. It also means that the harsh winters of the north are more endurable. And in an age when the difference between starvation and life, depending on the food production of your farms is pretty thin, to have increased rainfall and to have a warmer climate was a dramatic improvement on the ways of life. This increased warmth was met by a development in agriculture. Historically, peasants used to plant farms in what we call a two-field system. Farmers would take the land that they had allotted to them, and they would plow it in halves. And one field would lie dormant for a period of time, one season usually, and the other field would be harvested. Those of us who didn't grow up on farms, of course, may not understand this, but the reason is that the land needs time to recultivate. If you over-farm, if you overproduce off of one slot of land, it will become dry land, it will become dusty. The mineralization of the soil will erode. And this is a time, of course, before they had artificial fertilizers like we do today. And farmers combated this with a two-field system. Sometime, though, around the High Middle Ages, from 950 to 1250, sometime in this region, farmers simply do the math and they realize that they can have higher yields if they go to a three-field system. And that is, you take the same plot of land and you divide it into thirds. And what you then do is you plant one crop on a third of the strip of land, you plant a second crop on another third of the land, and then you leave the third strip uncultivated and untended so that it has a chance to replenish itself. Now, just the simple math of this means that you're now using 2/3 of your land as opposed to half, which means that you're actually bringing in more crops, you have more sustenance, and more of a capacity to sell surplus if you don't need all of it to eat. Small things make all the difference in the Middle Ages. And the last great invention for the farmer was the invention of a new yoke that could go over a horse. The traditional yoke was developed in the Mediterranean region, and it was predominantly used for oxen. And oxen, of course, are significantly larger, and they can hold a different style of yoke over their shoulders, allowing them to pull the plow behind them. In the north, though, oxen are not as plentiful. What you have in the north part of Europe is you have horses. The problem, though, for the medieval farmer was that if you took the oxen yoke and you put it over the horse, you would actually be choking it. It would go across its throat, the neck of the horse being so long, and it would begin to cut off the air supply to the horse. In the earlier part of the Middle Ages, you still had many farmers, therefore, plowing land by hand. And you can only imagine if you have to plant significant acreages of land in order to get enough of a crop production so that you can have enough yield both for your family and for the village as well as for sales, you're doing some backbreaking labor at this point. By the year 1000, however, the medieval peasants had devised a yoke that did manage to fit over a horse without choking the life out of it. And this yoke was a significant improvement. Suddenly, the natural labor force of the animals of the northern part of Europe could be leveraged. And so by the year 1000 and on into 1200, you have a significant improvement on the quality of life for the average commoner. Still, it was not all good times for the medieval commoner. One of the enduring legacies of the Roman world was the fact that it relied so heavily on slave labor. Many historians have pointed out that much of the reason why Rome engaged in so many wars around the country was due in large part to the fact that they needed a continuous supply of slave labor, and the best way to get slaves is to conquer foreign troops or foreign areas and then haul off the able-bodied slaves from those regions back to the Roman world. And in Europe, the slave market in general dies out as a result of the collapse of Rome. But what happens is the common folk, the lay folk, the peasants, end up being transferred into sort of a soft form of slavery. And that form of slavery is serfdom. Now, we can't equate the two. Roman slavery was a harsh reality. You often did not have much of a life expectancy in many cases if you were put out on a really harsh plot of land and given a harsh taskmaster under a Roman ruler. Still, the medieval peasant, the medieval commoner, eventually came to be tied to the land. Similar changes were happening amongst the nobility. If you go to the early Middle Ages, from, say, 550, a century after the fall of Rome, and carry it forward into the 900s, you do see an emergence of a warrior class that we would eventually come to call knights. You also see an emergence of people who were significantly wealthy, having fought their ways to dominance over certain areas of land. And these nobility, these warrior classes, become the nobility. They become kings, or at least the barons and the duchies and the orders that rule over vast areas of land. Now, for a long period of time, from, again, the fall of the Roman Empire up until maybe 1000, as a general mark, what happens is the order of the nobility and of the warrior classes was pretty fluid. All you really needed to establish yourself as one of the warrior classes, whether it's the nobility itself or what would become eventually the knights, is you needed the money to supply yourself with the necessary armaments and the troops and the horses required to be a knight or a warrior. And of course, the popular misconception we have, probably inspired by movies, is that there were knights aplenty all over Europe. In fact, for most of the Middle Ages, there were not that many knights at all. There were substantial amounts when you take into account all of Europe. But in local communities, they would be not all that plentiful. The armaments, the chainmail, the horses, trained specifically, shields and lances and swords and all these things were expensive. A knight would also need pages or servants to follow along and tend to the horses and tend to the armament, sharpening swords and feeding the horses and all these things. And you had to have a substantial amount of wealth to be able to afford all of this. Still, as with the peasants and as with the commoners, what you see happening is from the 5th century on down until the 11th century to the year 1000 and beyond, really, what you see happening is you see the formation of these ranks of the nobility and the knighthood of the warrior classes that begins to take on a more permanent shape. Whereas before, one could become a warrior or part of the warrior classes, or even potentially part of the nobility, by success in battle or by some other feats of strength. What happens by the year 1000 and on into the High Middle Ages is the nobility ranks become more fixed and more closed. And they do this by becoming hereditary. It suddenly becomes common to say that one cannot rise up to the ranks and become a lord or a regional ruler unless you are born into that family. And the idea of royal blood becomes significantly more impactful and important for Europe as we get beyond the year 1000. And lastly, when we look at the clergy, we see similar developments, though not as drastic. The big elephant in the room for the clergy was how do you incorporate monasticism and the hermit lifestyle or the Cenobite lifestyle into the wider clerical system. They are not servants of churches. They are not lords. They are not bishops. So where precisely does a monk fit? And as Europe begins to convert more and more, and as more churches are built, often as these noblemen, for example, and these rulers would take over regions, if they had a good relationship with the church, they would then begin to support cathedral building, church building, monasteries, scriptoriums, and all these things. And what happens is as the clergy begins to develop and deepen its roots throughout Europe and expand its influence, you begin to see changes amongst the clergy that were not prevalent in the early church when the period of persecutions was prevalent, or when you had the church facing overwhelmingly pagan communities. As Europe converts and becomes more Christianized, suddenly the culture of the Christian world begins to develop, and as that culture develops, as happens throughout history, as a Christian culture begins to develop, the differentiation between various levels of clergy also comes with it. I really do see this as more of a natural development. Again, we see this even in Protestant churches. If you were to look throughout history at places where the Protestant church was under fire, well, in those cases, the clergy were very often underdeveloped. That is to say, they did not make very fine distinctions between all the levels of clergy and who served as this function and who served in that function. It was really just a single clergy suffering and leading a flock that was being oppressed. During times of peace and prosperity, though, you find that the church can develop deeper roots, and as it develops deeper roots in a culture, it needs more responsive clergy to all of the various needs of a community. And this is really what happens in the Middle Ages. The clergy develops a number of new wings and a number of new developments within it as it begins to adapt to the ongoing changing landscape of Europe. Okay, if those are the players and those are the cultural conditions that gave rise to the differences between the three estates, what are the three estates? From the year 1000 to 1150 or even on to 1200, you begin to see a new philosophy of societal breakdown. It is difficult at times to determine, though, if this philosophy is the cause or the effect of all of the changes in medieval culture. And we really can't answer that question. But needless to say, from 1000 to 1150 as just a general round number, what happens is you begin to see intellectuals and the ruling classes begin to permanently break down society into three different cultures. And they refer to these as the three estates, or as it would eventually come to be called, the estates of the realm. And all this means is that there are three categories that you can find yourself in. You can find yourself in the top first class, the second class, or the third class. And the way this is often remembered, or as it's recalled, is that you can either be one who prays, one who fights, or one who works. Which is to say, you could be a member of the clergy, you could be a member of the nobility or the warrior classes, or you can be a commoner. Now, this isn't just a breakdown of a simple variation. Of course, it's not a matter of just what they do. Rather, what happens is as the philosophy of the three estates, or the estates of the realm, begins to develop, eventually what happens is you find yourself permanently assigned to one of these categories. It was not uncommon, for example, to believe that God had preordained these three estates, that he had set this up as the proper governing natural order of the world. And therefore, to try to usurp the order, to attempt to move from a peasant or a commoner, let's say a commoner becomes wealthy, becomes middle class, and then becomes a merchant and accrues a great deal of wealth. Well, then to start acting like a nobleman, to start rising up the ranks, to seek more authority in a community than is your due, was seen not really as blasphemy, but as a impropriety. It's seen as prideful usurpation of the way God had established the world. Now, of course, if you are a king, if you're at the very top of the noble ranks, very often you would resist the idea that you were just simply part of the second order of the classes. And so the one wrinkle that is eventually adopted is the king himself becomes, in some ways, a representative of God on earth. Now, of course, we're used to understanding that the papacy has declared himself to be Christ's vicar. But that was understood in the spiritual sense, and only in the High Middle Ages do you begin to see popes claiming to have temporal rulership as well. But kings did the same move. As they looked at the three estates, and as they got concerned that the nobility was going to maybe usurp them, was maybe going to challenge their authority, what you begin to see is kings begin to describe themselves as outside of these three estates. However, for just about everyone else, if you're not the pope or if you're not the king, you find yourself in one of these three estates. Okay, so let's go through the three estates and talk about some of the changes that went on during the Middle Ages as they shaped each of these groups. The first group we want to look at are those who worked. The third estate, those who were at technically the bottom rung of society. Now, it has always struck modern ears as a bit strange that those who make up 90 to 95% of a nation are seen as somehow the lower rank. But we have to remember that, in fact, this is not a moral judgment on them. This is not so much a claim that they are inferior people, though at times you sometimes get a little bit of snobbishness from the top rungs. But rather, the third estate is seen as a category of work. What do they do with their lives day in and day out? And of course, the third estate, what they do with their lives mostly is they work. Now, as we've already mentioned, from the transition from the late antiquity Roman period into the Middle Ages, what we see happen is a number of developments from Roman slavery into medieval serfdom. And we've already noticed that, in fact, serfdom has similar elements built into it. Constantine, in fact, in the 4th century, actually issued a decree declaring that peasants, that the workers on the fields, are tied to the land. That is to say, they can't leave. There is no mobility for them. They cannot pick up and find work elsewhere if there happens to be higher wages. There are no migratory work patterns then in the late antiquity period. If you are a serf, if you are a peasant, if you are a farmer, you are now tied to the soil on which you labor. And so for most of the late antiquity period, up until about the year 1000, life for the average farmer was servile. You raised crops, you served on the land, you tried to get enough to feed yourselves, and then a portion of it always went to the lord of the manor, the family that owned the estate. Now, there are all kinds of shadings and nuances and differences and varieties of this throughout medieval Europe, particularly over the centuries. And it's a bit of a problem to try to categorize all of medieval life at the lay level in one simple phrase or one simple category. But we have to sort of get a taste of what it was like. And so for the average person, in the vast majority of cases, lay life at the ground level was toil. It was labor. It was intensive. It was challenging. By the time you get to the year 1000, however, we begin to see some differences and some developments within the Third Estate that are positive developments for the history of the West. The most important development that we see happen is we see the rise of the middle classes, or at least groups of people who break away from the land itself, who accrue a certain amount of wealth for themselves and a certain amount of luxury and prosperity. And because of that, they are no longer bound to the land or to the lordly manors that had dotted all of Europe for most of the late antiquity period up until the early Middle Ages. And so by about the year 1000, and certainly on after that into the High Middle Ages, we see the rise of a group that we could generally call the burghers. Now, that's a German title. It's certainly not something we would categorize as French and English culture, but there are varieties of that in other countries as well. But we'll call them burghers for right now. But the burgher classes are a group of people who begin to separate themselves from the lower rung of the peasants. And within that societal strata, within that group, you see all kinds of work patterns and developments and trades develop that actually allows for more serious accrual of wealth and prosperity that leads to all other kinds of benefits with it as well. And within the development of that societal strata, we begin to see all kinds of developments in terms of the economic prosperity of these folks that begins to move them up the rungs of society. We see groups develop that are artisans, merchants, professionals of all kinds. These folks are generally not tied to the land itself, but rather are some of those who purchase from farmers and peasants out in the fields, and they themselves are predominantly urban. Now, this group will become a problem for the noble classes as the centuries wear on and as we get to the early modern period. One of the big problems, for example, is that once an artisan or a merchant or a banker or someone of substance rises up in wealth to the point that they are significantly wealthy, sometimes even being quasi-noble in terms of the wealth that they have accrued, what you see begin to happen is the noble classes institute what we call sumptuary laws. And most students of history find these laws to be kind of strange. Sumptuary laws limit, for example, the color of cloth that you're allowed to wear, or the quality of fabric you're allowed to wear. They limit how much food or the quality of food that you're allowed to eat. And they seem to sort of tamp down excess. And a lot of people see in this a puritanical desire to keep people frugal and to make sure that they don't eat too much and get fat and lazy. Is often what is happening in sumptuary laws actually is the nobles themselves are very much used to a certain quality of life. They have certain fabrics, certain colors that are very challenging to make, and they like these for themselves. They like these as things that mark them as nobles. And they don't like to see the middle classes or the upper middle classes rising up to their rank and wearing the things that they wear, eating the things that they eat, and, at least for the lay people, confusing who's really in charge here. One of the great examples of this is wearing purple or blue cloth. Now, before modern dyes and modern chemicals, the making of purple or blue cloth was considered to be a luxury. And this was actually due to the fact that it was incredibly challenging to make. To make the purple cloth of antiquity, for example, there was a certain crustacean in the Mediterranean that had to be cultivated and harvested and then crushed to get the purple dye from them. And this is why so very often purple robes are associated with royalty. It costs so much to have this fabric that, in fact, to have it means that you have enormous wealth. Well, that transitions into the medieval period in Europe to wearing blue cloth. And so what you see happening is with sumptuary laws, the merchants and the middle classes and the artisans, those who accrue a great amount of wealth, are held back from confusing the orders. They need to keep their place. They need to remain within their third estate. They do not need to confuse themselves by what they wear and what they eat with the higher rungs of society. Moving up one rung to the second estate, when we look at the noble classes, it is important to note that, in fact, the noble classes are very much in flux. Noble houses really sometimes had troubles figuring out where they began and where the warrior classes ended. And, as we've seen, with Constantine and then on into Charlemagne's reign, and then afterwards in the Frankish empires, and in many other countries as well, what we see happen is a number of these dynasties, a number of these noble classes, these noble houses, begin to see themselves as somehow God's chosen vassal on earth. In other words, it's not just the Pope in the Middle Ages who believes that he has authority in the spiritual realms to govern and to guide the church and doctrine and these things. The kings, the rulers, the noble classes themselves see themselves as in God's place on earth as well. And what happens from about 1000 until about 1100 or a little bit beyond is you see the papacy and the noble classes, the first and the second estates, get into a number of turf wars over who has the right to do certain things. And so one of the things we see nobility trying to do is to control the church in their regions. Now, there are occasional small turf wars, but there are also some pretty significantly large and important turf wars between the papacy and, in some cases, the Holy Roman Emperor or the King of France, for that matter. And over this time, the papacy asserts a pretty radical position, which is, for the first time, the papacy, seeing itself as the first order of society, seeing itself as the high rung on the order in which God has established the nations, begins to tell the second order of estates that they do not have the right to do anything to the church, to church properties, or to the priesthood. There are actually a number of fights between kings and the papacy over who has the right to appoint bishops. And very often the papacy asserts an unqualified doctrine that the papacy itself is the only one who can control the church. And so as the Middle Ages wear on, this second rung of estates, the nobility, begin to assert their own authority in their realms. Within the nobility itself, however, we begin to see some developments. As we've already mentioned, at times in the Middle Ages, the demarcation between a knight and a noble was often very thin. Sometimes there was no differentiation at all. Those who went to war, those who were the comites or the duques of a certain ruler, would often be parceled out land after a certain conquest was achieved. As time wears on, however, as the Middle Ages move into the higher Middle Ages, 1000 to 1200, what we begin to see is the nobility begins to guard itself more overtly and to put walls around what is a noble and what is not a noble. And so what begins to happen is the noble houses, who were originally warrior bands, warriors who had conquered certain regions for themselves, move from being more of a warrior class to being a noble class. We say sometimes in history that they move from being those who wear armor to being those who wear robes, those who are of the lordly estates with leisure and without the need to fight their own wars, but rather directing others to go out and fight on behalf of them. And lastly, when we look at the upper estate, the first estate, the clergy, we see a number of developments as well. During the higher Middle Ages, what begins to happen is that there are a number of tiers of clergy that begin to shape and develop within the Catholic Church itself. Of course, the glue that binds so much of the church together in the Middle Ages is the office of the bishop. The bishop is the supreme clerical jurisdiction in a diocese. He is over the priests. He is over all of those within a certain territory of land. But what begins to happen is the bishop and other higher clergy begin to separate themselves from what we might call the lower clergy simply by the fact of their power, their wealth, and their influence. In the Middle Ages, though, what begins to happen is bishops get wrapped up in the lordly offices of certain kingdoms. And what that does is it causes bishops and archbishops and other high-ranking clergy to take on elements of the noble classes that separate them not only from the clergy but especially from the laity. Well, as the Middle Ages wear on, you see the separation of the clergy occurring on a number of fronts. You see the bishops becoming more involved with statecraft, more involved with nations, more involved with politics itself. They increasingly find themselves more engaged at the first and the second level of estates, and less involved with the third or the lower estates. That is to say, the laity have very little interaction with bishops or the higher clergy. And this gives rise to a number of new avenues for ministry for those who can engage with the third estate. Monks, for example, despite the image that we sometimes have of them living in a cloister by themselves and having no engagement with a city or a society around them, in fact, very often were the people who did ministry to the laity. They had hospitals, at least a precursor to a hospital, where they would take care of the sick and the infirm. They would give out alms and money and all kinds of things to laity. They were the ministry of helps, we might say, in modern language. We also see the development of the lower clergy, the average parish priest, as being the one tasked especially with taking care of the laity, of taking care of those at the third estate level. Now, this is fine on one level, the idea that there are two ranks of clergy, those who engage at a high level and those who are in the trenches of ministry. But it's based on a bit of a faulty foundation. Simply because as the lordly spirituals, as those who are engaging at a high level, begin to separate themselves more and more from the average parish priest, the education and the quality of the parish priests in some countries and in some regions gets abysmally low. And it's that reality that the average parish priest in some regions, in some countries, is poorly educated and simply does not have the tools or the skill set or the education to really feed the flock and shepherd them well. What begins to happen is you begin to see some disgruntlement arise within the lay levels. And you begin to see, by the time you get into the later Middle Ages, a significant amount of concern that the clergy are not listening. In the end, the three estates form the backbone of life in the day-to-day existence of everyone in Europe. You were supposed to know your rank. You were supposed to know where you fit in God's scheme of life. And while it might seem oppressive to us, and it certainly was oppressive on many levels, the three estates is how medieval life functioned day in and day out in terms of one's calling.